Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September monthly collective transmission. So, many of you have attended these before, but for anyone here who is new, I like to open with a little introduction that explains who I am, what these are, and what you might receive from this experience. So, my name is Kat, and I am an initiated medicine woman in the lineage of the Dagara people. Now, this lineage does not have a name. We colloquially refer to it as wild medicine. And it is an ancient shamanic animistic tradition of divination. And there are many forms of divination. The ones I primarily work with are stick divination and voice divination. Now, divination is any medium that interfaces with unknown or invisible spirits or beings, ancestors in other realms, and basically is a way of communicating with them and asking them questions and receiving information. So, for these monthly collective transmissions, the information that I am gathering is really for the collective. For anyone here who is, receiving this information essentially. Normally, when I do divinations, it's one on one, it's focused on your questions, your life, your problems, etc. But when I do these, it's really about the most pressing issues for humanity, whatever is happening in this moment. And lately, what I've been doing is soliciting questions from my community to answer rather than just asking them about themes for the month or what have you. And I've been really appreciating the questions that have been coming down the line from the people in my network. So this month, we also did that as well. And actually, this month is a little, it's more focused than usual. Last month, I answered about, I think, 7 different questions. This month, I'm answering basically 3 questions. And so I will just jump on in because I think there's a lot here. So the question that came forward that someone presented is, what is going on with the masculine in our world right now? And they named that they had been witnessing and observing a lot of their friends who had been in challenging experiences or conversations or just energies with the masculine, and seeing a lot of kind of upheaval and miscommunication and kind of just like conflicting energies arising in this relational space. So the question was, what's happening and how do we heal and support the masculine right now? And I really like this question because I've also been witnessing a lot of that as well in my life, and in the lives of people connected with me. So there's definitely something happening here. And I wanted to investigate that and see what is up. Now, I mean, first things first, we are in a moment of empires falling, right? There's a lot coming up around the patriarchy in general, its influence, how it's manifested in our world. So this is not like a brand new thing, but I think what we are starting to see is the like immensity of it, the enormity of it. And that was really what they were pointing to first in terms of, this is the masculine shadow and it is very old and it is in crisis. And you might say, well, of course, like it's been in crisis for a long time. Patriarchy isn't helpful, it's problematic. And this is true, but what they wanted to say is that as with anything, we cannot force healing. So until the conditions are right for healing to occur, it's just going to be like hitting a solid door. And that's kind of been the case with the masculine shadow and the wounding around the masculine, right? For a long time, the conditions weren't exactly right. Like, yes, it was problematic. Yes, it had maybe impacts that were negative for certain groups or people or what have you. Um, but now the conditions have shifted so that you could say that the masculine is actually ready to enact healing. It is ready to receive and work with a different set of energies. And so, what is happening right now for the masculine is a healing crisis. And the way that they frame that crisis is that the seeds that were sown by this shadow, right, by the wounds of patriarchy or what have you, have finally borne their fruit, which means like when something is not yet developed enough, it's hard to see the consequences, the full impact of the trauma. So even though there's been many people for a long time, kind of throwing up their flags and saying, hey, there's a problem here, until the, you know, the people or the conditions at the root of the problem were really ready to shift, there wasn't much that could really happen, even if it was causing a lot of trauma. So now we've actually started to see all the effects of that, right? We actually had to let things kind of develop to get to a point where it became completely unsustainable and untenable. And not just for the people who were impacted, but also the ones who were doing the actions, right? The oppressors or the masculine. And I actually don't really want to use the word oppressors because even though some of these consequences have been deeply oppressive, I don't think it serves us to frame the masculine in and of itself as an oppressor. So the shadow itself is oppressive, however. Now we are finally like, what is happening here is that the enormity and like full picture of the pain and the consequences that have arisen from this shadow have been laid bare. And we are fully reckoning with that, everyone involved, right? The masculine, as well as all of the people that have been impacted by this shadow. So, with this kind of reckoning, when something finally bears fruit, we can see it more clearly, right? We can see all of the energies, we can see the roots of it, we can really start to contemplate all of the forces and dynamics that have been involved from a larger level. We can see the bigger picture more clearly. Um, it's hard to appreciate the impact of trauma until the scale of it becomes so painful, enormous, and impossible to ignore. Now, that's kind of a painful truth. So I don't want to like make light of that, but that is the nature of what wakes people up, right? It's, you know, we can easily dismiss something that's a headache or that's a, oh, my shoulder hurts. But if it's all of a sudden cancer, if it's a brain tumor, if it's a big thing that we're looking at in the face, we are much more motivated to do something about it. And that's kind of what's happening now. Um, we can no longer dismiss it. We can no longer look away from it. And so everyone is being forced to look right at it and actually ask, what are we going to do about it? And it isn't just men, right? It isn't just the masculine that is tasked with cleaning this up. It really is everyone. And I know that as a woman who has been confronting some of the trauma and pain that have come from my experiences with the masculine, there's a part of me that's like, well, I don't want to have to be responsible for this mess. Like, I didn't cause it. But unfortunately, we are all part of the problem. We are all somewhat complicit in it if we are participating in it. So we are a part of that solution. We must be. And I think that's a big piece of this is actually taking on that responsibility because it is a community healing, it is a community work that we are going to have to engage in order to see change at the level that we desire. So, of course, some of these things we already know. The root and the seed of the masculine shadow is about power. And that's actually at the root of both the masculine and feminine shadows. And we're going to talk about that because as I was getting into this, I was like, oh, you really can't talk about one without the other because they're woven together. They influence each other. And the conditions with that both utilize and become corrupted by are kind of like two sides of the same coin. So I think that's really important. And that's why it's also impossible to just look at or point fingers at one and say you're the problem. So, okay, so the root of this, the seed of this shadow is about power. Now, the shadow of the masculine is supremacy. That's the shadow of that particular dynamic of power, power over. Whereas the shadow of the feminine is codependency, right? And that's a little bit different, right? That's almost like a giving away power in trying to navigate or find a greater balance within a system. It is a method of control, but it's a more manipulative, kind of covert method of control when it's in the shadow stage. So both of these are rooted in relational dynamics and how we engage with other people and enact our power within these like systems. So each shadow, the way that I see it is each shadow deals with a power displacement, right? It's a misuse and abuse of power. And there is a way that power can be expressed and enacted where it's in integrity, right? Where it's in its integrous alignment and is healthy in that expression and in the enactment of that power. And there are differences and distinctions, right? And I do also want to say that although this comes off as very gendered, that we all have masculine expressions of power and we all have feminine expressions of power. Some of us rely more heavily on our masculine, some of us rely more heavily on our feminine. So this isn't just limited to a gendered way of being. So, and that kind of also adds a layer of complexity that makes this a little bit more difficult to talk about. So if I'm oversimplifying, that's part of this, is that I'm trying to really look at what does it mean just from like a masculine expression, not necessarily saying this is, male-bodied people who are the only ones who use this kind of power. But nonetheless, when we talk about the masculine and the feminine in terms of energies, we often look at the expressions of how power and energy moves and how they relate to one another. So when one of these or both of these are out of integrity or out of balance, they are in their shadow state, right? So when that happens, they're actually shifting the natural equilibrium of the relational dynamic. So this is really interesting. And I will say that I don't think in this conversation, like there's not a clear cut solution or way forward. I think it's a deeply spiritual and individual meditation and reflection on how do we hold power? How do we relate to power? And what does that actually look like for us? But I thought what the beings had to say about it was really fascinating. And they talked about how to be in balance. One must live in the roots of their being. And, you know, I find that a really interesting way of framing things because when we live in the roots of things, we are really connected not only to our like root chakra, right? Like our power source, but also literally roots exist in places of darkness. And I don't mean darkness as an evil or bad, but darkness that is below the surface. And there's this trend in our culture that I see that's called light supremacy, love and light and, high vibe. And those are kind of thrown around as sort of like this ideal of spirituality. Even the term ascension, right? This rising above instead of going below. And again, prioritizing of a certain vibe or experience over something else. And all forms of supremacy are dangerous. So to me, when people talk about love and light or ascension without acknowledging that all transformation and all life begins in the darkness, they're missing a huge part of the whole picture. And they're privileging an experience that is disconnected from source. Okay, literally. If you are living, like if you think about a tree, if you are living in the branches of that tree without roots, you don't have resources, you don't have nutrients, you can't actually survive without roots. So this was a really interesting concept to me in that, you think about what darkness is in terms of its functionality, not in terms of the ideas we project upon it. We project a lot of ideas onto darkness as it being a place of, again, bad or like evil or wrong, when that's not the case at all. Different things happen in the darkness. Night is just as important as the daytime, right? We have to sleep in order to be here and awake in the daylight. So, like I said, all life begins in darkness. True transformation, you think about a caterpillar, it metamorphosizes inside of a cocoon. That happens in a kind of darkness, right? When you think about birth begins inside the womb, which is a place of darkness. So it's like there's this desire to, give darkness a greater weight in our culture and to recognize this place as a holy place, as a necessary place where change must occur. And I often call myself a root worker because I recognize that so much of my true work has been in the roots, right? And not only the roots of myself, of my being, but that's also the roots of where we start to connect with the ancestral realm, with the powers and inheritance, the gifts, the wounds that have passed down to us, right? So it's through that channel that we can actually start to transform, heal, and evolve the traumas that we incarnated with, right? That were passed down to us through our ancestral lineages, and also to get into the very core of our own work that we are here to do on this in this lifetime on this planet. So it's really in the roots that we can start to see what what wounding do we have? What gifts do we have? What is here for me? Who am I entangled with? Right? What are all of the threads kind of connecting me with the nutrients, the life-giving resources that are in my life? That all comes to us through the roots. And again, it's not always a very conscious place because it is underground, because it is so internal. And because of that, it can be really hard to see and to look at. So, but it is here that the energies nourish us, that give us life, that feed us, and where we start to cultivate sustenance that actually sustains us. So I invite you to think about what happens in the darkness. And one of my favorite medicines, which is mushrooms, they do a lot of very powerful work in the dark. I love looking at mushrooms and how they function in nature because it's very telling. It also points to how they function when we ingest them as medicine. So mushrooms do a lot of work exchanging information underground. They actually help trees like exchange nutrients and bring the right sources of nitrogen into the roots. They also break down what is dead, what is stagnant, old energy, and they compost that. They return that to the earth so that new life can actually utilize that energy and pull from it to become bigger, to become stronger. So I'm curious, like that is something to really meditate upon is what is your relationship to darkness? What is happening in your root systems? What are your root systems connected to? Because there is so much here for us all to look at and to reclaim is our root systems. And in addition to what's happening internally in your like soul roots, how we are connected to the earth is a big part of our rootedness. And when I look at kind of the larger picture of how patriarchy has influenced and created damaging impacts on our planet, I look at, the way that industrial society has just run amok, this idea of endless scaling and expansion without any true relationship with the earth. It's a domination over the earth. And that is not healthy. That is not good. That is not taking us to any happy place, right? It's creating climate change. It's creating all of these other kind of situations that are compounding and creating untenable living situations for us as humans. So, one of the things I see happening a lot in the West is that we are a culture of rootlessness. So many of us here in the West do not have our connections to our ancestors, to a sense of responsibility for land, for place. Instead, we have entitlement and arrogance. We don't have a relationship, and that distances us from what's happening all around us. If we really were connected to the land, would we treat it so badly? Would we allow our life-giving waters to be polluted? It makes no sense when you really think about it. So the roots are where we are connected to life-giving resources in all respects. right? Physically, spiritually, ancestrally. And when we think about that, when we think about power in that way, there's an exchange, there's an interdependence and an entanglement that's everything is dependent on everything else, right? It really has nothing to do with power over because everything relies upon one another. And when I think about that, when I think about life-giving resources and how they are constantly in exchange with one another, that seems to me like a very powerful metaphor for the reconfiguration and recalibration of the masculine and the feminine. So, when I think about power, I think about how we are connected to land, how we honor and respect land, because that informs our movements in so many other ways. I think about how that also creates a literal grounded embodiment for ourselves. This idea of ascension, spiritual evolution that is disembodied makes no sense to me. Like, why go up? You need to come down and root into yourself because that's the only place where your transformation can happen. Otherwise, you are not on this earth. You are not in this realm. You are not grounding the change that is taking place. And therefore, you cannot access the power within it. And again, coming back to this whole idea of exchange, when we recognize that we are entangled, right? We are in exchange with so many other beings and resources on this world, that we are a vital part of this web. And in honoring that, it sustains us. And when we isolate ourselves from that, it's unhealthy, it's destructive, and it's dangerous. We actually can't function like that. And our whole world right now, right? This idea that we can distance ourselves or dominate this web without any of the consequences, that's it. That's an artificial reality. And there are consequences to that distancing, to that trying to live outside of it. And we are living in those consequences right now. So there's a lot here and it can feel very big and heady, but what I want to say is that if you have not connected to your rootedness, right, you will try and create that through others, which is what we see happening with um, these ways of power kind of becoming distorted. So the masculine form of supremacy, domination, is again trying to find a way of rooting through others, through the control of others. And for the feminine, it's again through this relational codependency of control that's through other people, not by dominating them, but through a sense of needing. And of course, we all need each other. So I want to make that distinction, but it's almost this sense of losing oneself in that system versus maintaining a clear agency and sovereignty that is also interdependent. So these are very subtle distinctions, but it helps to make them. So the deep womb of creation is a dark place. And when we think about darkness, if we respect the darkness, it fosters respect for what emerges from it. And I notice in our culture that because we have such an obsession with this like light supremacy, with this ascension, with like, you know, we don't have respect for the things that emerge from the dark. Think about how women's bodies are regulated, how there's so little regard for how to truly honor the birth process and what is required and asked of a woman to surrender to that. So when we think about power, there is a critical exchange that happens and that is a part of enacting our power in this world in a healthy way. And that's kind of at the heart of this. That there is a critical exchange born of humility and respect for the wisdom of the other on both sides. And to try and live to, again, distance ourselves from that wisdom, right? To isolate oneself will surely create and enable the conditions that foster power imbalances. So I think this is really interesting, right? Because again, it comes back to this whole idea of like, even if it doesn't feel like my problem, it is my problem. And that's something that I think is really hard for many of us to swallow, because those who are impacted adversely or, disproportionately by these problems of the masculine supremacy don't want to exert more emotional labor to clean it up. And I get that. But unfortunately, we were made this way. We were made to exchange energy and resources and information. And so there is an inherent need for that exchange to happen in order for us to clean up this mess. Now, it can look different ways. Women, or I should say the feminine, has information for the masculine, right? It's a key. Masculine needs that key. And the same for women. The masculine has a key for women, and we need it, right? We need to work together to fully enable the fullest aspect of our true healthy power. Now, there wasn't so much a ritual as there was a series of questions. So I'll share these. Now, to the masculine, whether that's to men in general or to those who identify as men or to people who feel more masculine or feel stuck inside of a masculine expression. The questions that they asked or that they presented were, where have you sought out women to learn from them? Have you asked the dark feminine for guidance? Have you humbled yourself enough to listen? How have you allowed yourself to be entangled in the roots and web of life? Recognizing that, yes, you are interdependent, that part of your survival requires other people. And there's sort of like a deeper level of acknowledgement that wants to happen there. Have you allowed the vulnerability of asking for help? So it's funny because I know there's a lot of women in my life where asking for help is really hard. And that was something that they also brought forward for the masculine. They were like, they need to also be able to ask for help and to allow and embrace that help when it arrives. The masculine is not supposed to do everything on its own, in the same way that neither is the feminine. Power in isolation and power that isolates is dangerous. So this is something that both sides need to be mindful of. Now, the feminine is born through connection and through entanglement. And I mean, both men and women are, let's be real. But I say this because only the feminine has an embodied understanding of what it means to give birth, to literally carry life that is connected to you, but also individuating through you, is a wholly feminine expression and experience. And so this, where does the mother's body end and the infant's begin? Like there is a period of time where we couldn't really draw the line, right? Without creating a form of death. So it is this connection that reveals the feminine's inherent entanglement with all things, right? The essential interconnectedness that life itself is built upon. And so even though men are born through this connection as well, or the masculine, they don't engender this through their bodies. And so there's almost like a lost memory there that wants to be reclaimed, but is difficult because it's not going to come through the physical embodiment of carrying life in a womb. Now, they were talking about it's interesting because in writing these power imbalances, it's easy to kind of get into a tit for tat headspace. Well, if the masculine gets this, we want that, right? And it's not that clear cut and not that easy. And I say this as a feminine embodied being that what seems like almost like an overemphasis on the feminine principles and energy is actually in service to both. And I preface all of this because what I'm about to say could sound like me just being like, let's get those women in power. But the rematriation, right, of power requires the supplication of the masculine to the feminine principle. And that is not a submission. It is also not a dominance, but it is a recognition that number one, submission and dominance are false dichotomies born of a masculine perspective, in either or. And the feminine has a different experience and a different perspective that's really difficult to put into words. But the way that I think of it is kind of like an inherent switchiness, right? A fluidity, the recognition that there's an exchange here, and that being able to move fluidly into different forms, roles as needed is actually at the heart of this power like recalibration. There's the masculine has a sense of rigidity that is getting in the way. And rigidity isn't normal. Rigid power structures are inherently fragile. And the feminine principle kind of understands this, right? We are that like chaotic creative force. We are able to move and shift and embody new ways and roles, I think, a little bit more easily than the masculine. But the masculine is getting kind of stuck in this idea of power that is no longer serving it, that is actually becoming its detriment. So it is important that the masculine recognize that there is a form of feminine leadership that actually allows it to still experience and have and own its power, but that it will look different, that the masculine is not actually defining that, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to kind of go more into that in a second. But what I want to say is that in addition to these questions that I've presented, the ritual that was given for the masculine is ask the women in your life, if you are a masculine embodied being, if you are struggling to kind of let go of this power over dynamic, again, this could be something that's taking place inside of a female, to really ask other women in your life what they need and listen and honor these requests without dismissing them. Because there is sort of a like, how can I serve this feminine principle and energy, recognizing that it's also in service to me if I do so, which again might feel really counterintuitive to a lot of the masculine ideas of power and how they are expressed right now on this planet. But we're kind of reaching the end of the wall with that. So what's needed is a drastic redirect and approach that, of course, is not going to look anything like the current one. So try that on for size, see what happens. We're in a lot of like existential kind of conceptual territory here. So I want to acknowledge that like it could look very different for a lot of different people to play with that and practice that. Now, if we're going to look at two sides of this coin, then really the other question is how do we support, help, and heal the feminine? Because there is a role and rebalancing for the feminine as well. Now, what they said is that the feminine are the dark dreamers, dreamers who navigate the dark mysteries, the vision holders and keepers of the future. Now, the way that it was sort of given to me in terms of in a concept was that masculine power is often like the engine of a ship, right? It has tremendous power. It has this capacity to make things happen, right? To literally be a vessel, a structure. That's a better word, a structure. Whereas the feminine principle and power is like the rudder of that ship. It's actually helping navigate from a deeper place, right? If you think about the rudder, it's in the water, it's in the dark water. And that's a different form of seeing. So the rudder of the engine of the masculine is the feminine. And it's, there's that quote where it's like behind every man is a powerful woman. It's kind of like that, right? There's this like deeper vision holder that is helping the masculine like enact their power in and giving it a little bit of like a form. Now it's interesting because I had to some of the things that they're saying kind of seem to run counterintuitive to the ways in which I've heard the masculine or feminine expressed or talked about, but it's kind of like the yin yang, right? Where it's like the more you go into the feminine power, the more you start to see how it actually starts to touch and yield to a masculinity and vice versa. Now, without the rudder of this sort of like feminine guidance, this vision holding, the masculine engine becomes unwieldy and unfocused, kind of eating its way forward. It becomes more destructive. And the way what they said is that almost like Saturn devouring its children, right? It like it almost kind of becomes that feminine chaos. So I love this because it tells me that like there is no, again, hard, sharp lines around these definitions, but rather embracing that yin yang of like if you go deep and far into one, you're going to start to move into the other. And I think that's the energy that we're really being asked to remember and recognize. The feminine must be emboldened to level set. That's one of the shifts that need to happen in terms of this rematriation of power, is there's been a lot of women looking to the masculine to set that direction, when in reality, we're holding the vision and the masculine is enacting that vision. So we need to step into that, to speak the vision, to help create the boundaries around that are going to enact it. But again, to let the power of the masculine enable its articulation and embodiment. So this is a big reason that we are starting to see a lot of female, feminine beings stepping into power at greater levels, right? Like Kamala Harris is a great example, because there is a rematriation of power. And again, that's not to the detriment of the masculine. It's actually calling the masculine into a more holistic expression of their own power in ways that are not destructive, but rather constructive, co-created. Again, what they said is it is not a dethronement of the masculine. I like that. In its highest expression, the masculine is supporting the creation of woman, right? From birth in its most like literal form into the most conceptual. So they were saying, think about the role a man occupies when a woman is actually giving birth. And, maybe this is a little bit like heteronormative, but forgive me, forgive the beings. This is what they said. Like the woman is there, like pushing, like she is holding the vision of like, this child is going to be born. But the man is there, like supporting, holding, being like, getting her ice chips, like talking her through it. There's a really interesting, again, sort of shift in how we might normally understand the masculine and feminine energies of power there. But in that moment, the feminine relies upon the enthusiasm, the energy, the activating spark to sustain herself through the chaos of the unknown. So it is time for the feminine to speak to the masculine in their life, in their world, in their reality, and let them serve. Well, first of all, to speak what they need and to be ruthless in that speaking. This is not to say it's not power over again. We're stepping away from that, but to be clear in that, to honor the true desires of their heart, of their needs in that moment, and to speak them so that the masculine can see the opportunity that's being presented to them. I think there's a lot of like hiding, right? This fear of like, oh, if I actually ask for what I want, it'll scare someone away. When in reality, it really equips the masculine with understanding what is needed. They said that women are way showers. So it is essential that we stop dimming or dismissing our oracle when it speaks difficult truths, difficult needs, right? Things that feel like too much. To let that speaking be loud be clear. And again, they use the term ruthless. And this is not a power over or a way to be cruel, but rather a way to be very honest. Because it isn't about demanding things or being coercive, but rather being so clear and honest about what is needed that it allows the masculine to gather itself and come together, make that possible. And to allow the masculine an agency in making that happen. I think there's a lot of covert control tactics that start to happen where, you know, women get fearful or start to micromanage or don't trust that the men can do that, etc. So the masculine does need agency in determining what is like the ingredients needed to make this thing happen. And for the feminine to become a collaborator who trusts that wisdom of building, that wisdom of enabling the vision and articulating it. So that's really the ritual, is for there to be a shift in how we utilize our power, and for that to be done in ways that are both compassionate and clear, to not hold back. So, and this kind of segues into my last question, which I think is a little bit broader and also still connected, which is how can we practice cultivating self-worth, um, you know, with guidance or inspiration from the spirits and nature? And I love this because, again, we're talking about supremacy, and the rise of human supremacy in the West comes at the expense of deep relationship and connection with everything. Whether you want to call that God, whether you want to call that nature, the spirits, but it's the everything, right? It is the infinite wisdom that is available through all the things that we are interconnected with. Now, there is a fundamental paradox at the heart of existence. You are a cell. You are a cell of the Godhead, which means that you are part of this larger experience of God that is always happening, a co-creator of reality, if you will. And you are a flawed, finite human being who feels their limits and boundaries and humanness. And you are also subject to the rules of universal law, right? You are not the creator of the law. So that's kind of the thing. You cannot operate outside of those laws, but you can operate within them like a god. Now, splitting, again, kind of going back to this idea in the West of like our rootlessness and how we see ourselves kind of above nature, like we are here to dominate it instead of work with it and live within it. But splitting from nature and seeing ourselves as outside of nature, it was a irreparable rupture that from a core relationship that informed our understanding of these rules and how to work within them. So like it was almost like we had a deeper, clearer sense of our place and our like the necessity and essentialness of our part in that web. We lost that understanding when we stepped back from it. So, you know, it's like we're playing a board game, but we threw away the rules and now we're wondering how the fuck to win, right? It's like everything's kind of scrambled. We don't have that clear sense of that we used to have of like, oh, this is where I'm needed. This is where I participate, and how important and essential that is to the functioning of everything. Instead, we've got this like outsized arrogance and entitlement, while at the same time feeling deeply unworthy, like deeply disconnected, deeply unwell. But, you know, I think there's this very human idea of self-worth as like, we got to have it all figured out, right? Like having all the answers, knowing what to do, doing it right, doing it well. Like so much of self-worth from a human perspective is connected with achievement, success. And that's really all backwards. We are not supposed to have all the answers. That is impossible. At the same time, all of the answers exist everywhere around us. And if we were to replug back into that web and talk to all of these other forms of intelligence, we would have access. We still have access, right? Like that doorway is still there. But it's kind of like we forgot that there's a doorknob that we know how to use, right? So that is why connection to nature and the recognition of nature as I mean, nature as a whole, but like all of the elemental beings within it, trees, rocks, waters, birds, animals, right? Plant medicine. These are all connection and access points to an infinite realm of wisdom. And this wisdom is here for us. It wants to be accessed. But when we step back and started dominating it, it's like we started destroying those doorways without regard for the fact that we need them. And here's the thing, being woven into that web, recognizing ourselves as like on a horizontal plane, not a vertical one. We're not above it, beyond it, or outside of it. We're within it. We're a part of it, right? And from that perspective, we're actually all equal. When you recognize something as an equal, you are actually more prepared to learn from it, right? In the same way that, like, if you see a friend as like a wise person, you're more likely to take their advice. If you see someone as a dum dum in your life, you're not going to listen to them. So we've kind of like sabotaged ourselves by looking at nature as like this, unevolved ecosystem, when in reality it is the most like the most supreme form of intelligence on this planet. Okay, nature was doing just fine before humans got here, and it's gonna be doing just fine after we fucking extinct ourselves off this planet. So I'm not too worried about nature. I am worried about us. But going back to this, when we have stepped outside of that relationship, outside of that connection with the everything, it puts more pressure on ourselves to like figure it out, to like have all the answers, right? And then of course comes this obsession with achievement that humans are so fixated on. And that starts to make things incredibly difficult. It adds a level of pressure that's just like enormous. And it also reinforces the experience of failure, which impacts self-worth and a feeling of satisfaction, a feeling of like, I belong. So you start to see that it's like this runaway train that we did to ourselves. And maybe this is getting kind of like very heady in regards to like a question about self-worth, but I think it's actually a really interesting reframe on self-worth, which is like when you are responsible to so many other things greater than you see yourself differently. You start to see yourself not as like a God above all, but like, a critical piece of this larger machinery. In the same way that a loose screw could undo an entire engine, right? And make it fail. We are that screw. It might seem like a lowly little role to play, but it's actually a really important one. So, what they were saying around like this whole piece of self-worth is like really interesting because there isn't like a be all stopgap, right? It's not like, boom, here's the magic answer. Now you have endless self-worth. But what they're asking for and what they are prescribing in regards to a ritual, I think is really fascinating because it comes back to this idea of like, you are not supposed to know everything. You are not supposed to figure everything out on your own. Put yourself back in that web and see what happens and start to see nature as that equal, and you will experience yourself differently. So when you have a struggle, when you have a problem, um, go out into nature. And here's the thing, go walk somewhere wild and wait until you are called. Like hold the inquiry or the question or the challenge that you have in your mind and just look, 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 look. Wait for something to draw you. Maybe it's a tree, maybe it's a stone, maybe it's a butterfly, maybe it's a dead animal. Go to it and engage with it, talk to it, tell it your problems, tell it your most intimate fears and doubts. Become known to yourself and share this experience with something that cannot judge your experience, that literally has no expectations of you, right? It's different from going to like a friend or a teacher. It's just you sharing, and do this out loud. Dialogue with it. And here's the thing, ask it for help, ask it for something, and wait for an answer. You might have to wait for a minute, right? It's not being like talking to Chat GPT. You might have to really sit there. You might have to really like stew in it. But I think that's kind of the point, to recognize that, again, you're plugging yourself back in. So let go of your own ideas of what an answer looks like or how it's supposed to arrive, and see if you can enter into a kind of larger than life awareness of an exchange, a critical exchange of information. Can you deprioritize or um, open yourself up to a way of experiencing the world that is maybe not human? How might you interpret what arrives? Now, I love this because nature is such a mirror for the human soul. The human soul is the wildest part of our experience. And therefore, when we go out into nature and see ourselves through nature, we see more of ourselves. Like it's impossible not to. So it is through this dialogue with the other. Nature is very much the other for most of us, right? We've removed ourselves. It's like, oh, I go to the park. That's nature. We forget that we are constantly enmeshed in nature. And I think this experience really helps to shift that. Like look at yourself talking to this dead animal carcass. That's powerful. That deprivileges a certain idea of what you are and allows a new experience to come forward. And I think our willingness to engage the other without expectations is what allows us to uncover surprising answers. We are able to see ourselves and look within because there's a different mirror available. And ultimately, what they're saying is like, this is a powerful way to fall into relationship with existence, right? To stop almost utilizing nature as like your answer machine and to be in relationship with it. So this is where we are going to find a sense of self-worth that isn't related or attached to anything outside of yourself. I think that's another thing that is really at play here. Again, coming back to this whole idea of like self-worth as like doing something, being something, versus acknowledging and embracing exactly what you are, who you are in its total, complete, messy perfection. To just simply allow a greater perspective. Life is always revealing you to you. We miss that mirror a lot when we're caught in the hamster wheel of like modern life, right? We're on this like escalator of like job success and relationship success and all of these places we're trying to go or get to. That it's kind of sometimes we can miss the journey for the destination. And the other thing that they were saying is that we often edit ourselves down to fit others' ideas of us or what we're supposed to be or do, right? This idea, and I see it a lot in divs, is like, oh, I'm supposed to have this like soul purpose. Like, what is that purpose? And don't get me wrong, I'm sure we all have a soul purpose to some extent, but it very rarely looks like we expect it to look. It's never a doing, it's a becoming, it's a being. And so having a relationship with yourself that is not contingent upon another human idea or limiting way of seeing yourself is really healthy. See yourself first. See yourself outside of anyone else's definitions of what it means to be human. And you might see something new. Because when we rely on another human to justify or validate our experience of reality or our experience of ourselves, it is fundamentally invalidating. what might be true for us, but maybe no one else can understand. And that's like a hard truth to accept, that there might be things about ourselves that only we can validate, only we can truly love and accept. So I love this practice because it seems to me a practice of that, of becoming more known to ourselves through interaction with the everything in order to really fully receive the full experience of who we are, unfiltered, and then bring that out into the world, bring that back into your experience of reality. So that's the quest that's given to you if you wish to develop more of your self-worth. And I'm very curious to see how it goes. So please keep me posted. And thank you so much for being here for this transmission. I bless you all. Hope you have a beautiful day, and we'll talk soon.